Is this planet X Nibiru's estimated arrival date, according to physics? It should be noted, this was written before the whole Planet 9 announcement back in January 2016, so NASA was well in full denial mode at that point. It's a long and in-depth read about highly recommended. As a matter of fact, it may have to be read a few times to grasp some of the detailed science provided, but not to worry, it will be here for perusal. Now, where was Planet X and when? This is according to the article I will leave below for you on Embedded Reality. The existence of a large body of some kind, most often referred to as Planet X, Nibiru, Planet 9, Wormwood, various names, that can account for the orbital irregularities of Neptune and Uranus has been the subject of research now for a century. The discovery of Pluto in 1930 occurred while astronomers were looking for this body, but they soon realized that Pluto is much too small to account for the observed deviations. With the changing political realities, there is no longer a fully credible information source regarding what exactly Planet X Nibiru is, where is it now, or where it might be at any future time. Most importantly, for the term near, speculation, false assumptions, disinformation are rampant. Curiously, NASA now officially denies Planet X even exists, although this was certainly not the case up to the mid-1980s. NASA seems to have gone completely silent on the idea in the early 1990s, maybe because Planet X might pose a danger to the Earth at some point in its orbit. But the agency did provide a number of interesting details well before that time. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box. So even though NASA seems to have gone silent on the idea in the early 1990s, because Planet X might pose a danger to Earth at some point in orbit, the agency did provide a number of interesting details before that time that can be used to piece together an approximate arrival time using that data together with classical textbook orbital physics, and we can begin publishing the data on that. Now, the video before this one, you'll notice an astronomer from England rehashed the data from the 1983 far infrared telescope images of our solar system and found what he believes could be Planet X, Planet 9, and it's on the orbital plane of our galaxy. So you could see that if you'd like. Now, Planet X could pose a danger to Earth, as Zachariah Sitchin of the Sumerian tablets told us. Now, one of the earliest articles describing NASA's search for Planet X, appearing in the November issue of 1989 of Science Digest, written by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Professor Emeritus of Astronomy at Northwestern University. The article stated that the orbital anomalies of Neptune and Uranus could be caused by either a planetary object 4 to 7 billion miles away, or a much larger object, such as a brown dwarf at a distance of about 50 billion miles from us. Dr. Hynek said that NASA believed the data coming from the Pioneer 10 and 11 space probes, launched in 1972 and 73 respectively, would allow scientists at NASA's research site in Pasadena, California, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory JPL, to determine which of the two it is. He also said that a telescope on board the satellite called IRAS, IRAS, would provide additional search capabilities. Now, planetary scientists at NASA Ames Research Center plan to use, they said, the infrared astronomy satellite IRAS to try to find a brown dwarf in our solar system or even farther out in space. A diagram depicts the solar system with both celestial objects and the 2 space probes, Pioneer 10 shown as heading nominally in the presumed direction of the two objects, and Pioneer 11 heading in the opposite direction. On January 30th, 1983, New York Times published an article entitled by John Noble Wilford, wherein John Anderson, at that time a senior research scientist at JPL, with a long background of leading roles in the Mariner, Pioneer, and Galileo missions, is quoted as having said this. But most significant are the words later on in the article. In fact, the fact that was exactly what NASA had in mind, the first official indication from NASA that a large distant celestial body well beyond the orbit of Pluto might actually be confirmed, appeared in the Washington Post late the same year, in December 1983, based on observations in January of that year of the IRIS satellite. And further articles state this number was corrected by the Post the following day, 50 billion miles, which is about 538 AU. The object was later declared to be a red dwarf and given the name M6V11825 Minoris. And yet shortly afterwards, it was mysteriously deleted from the official astronomical record without any explanation. Why is that? In late 1986, the latest edition of the New Illustrated Science and Invention Encyclopedia for 87 to 89 came out with a discussion about NASA Pioneer probes that also contained information about Planet X. And on page 2488, a pictorial diagram shows the distance of the dead star, quote unquote, that may form the binary companion of our own sun, and indicated on the diagram as being 50 billion miles from our Earth, presumably the object observed twice by IRIS in 1983. In fact, this diagram appears to be the very same one that appeared in the Science Digest article written by Dr. Hynek in 1982, with one small change. Text beside the object labeled as 10th planet, or Planet X, indicates a distance of 4.7 billion miles from Earth, which may have been an inadvertent distortion of the likely source diagram, which showed a possible 10th planet as being 4.7 billion miles from Earth. No information regarding who made the estimates, how or in what time frame is provided in the text or caption, but the source is obviously NASA's disclosure from 1982 and possibly 1983 as well. Although the diagram clearly shows two objects, one at 50 billion miles distance and another mentioned explicitly and referred to as Planet X at 4.7 billion miles away, this may have been no more than a repeat of the original diagram's implied conjecture from the Science Digest article of two candidate possibilities for the perturbing object. So it may be two, not one. In June of 1988, journalist John Wilford published another article in the New York Times about the Pioneer missions, which discussed the search for Planet X specifically. This article revealed additional information regarding NASA's plans to use both Pioneer missions to detect the presence of Planet X. JPL's John Anderson again served as a spokesman for that search and said that the two craft were equipped to detect any gravitational anomalies that might be caused by Planet X, but that so far none had been detected. Anderson said the Pioneer 10 was about 45 AU from the Sun at the time, mid-year 1988, traveling at about 28,400 miles an hour, or 12.6 kilometers per second. In the article's words, in the late 80s, NASA published the first results of a massive study effort led by senior scientist Dr. Robert Harrington, supervisor astronomer of the Naval Observatory at the time, and since deceased, who dedicated a substantial portion of his last years pursuing the whereabouts of Planet X. The paper was titled and published in 1988. In that study, Harrington claimed to believe in the existence of Planet X having 3 to 7 Earth masses and could account for the orbital perturbations of Neptune and Uranus, but it was clear he did not believe its orbit or location had been pinned down at the time. Nor did he mention anything about a much larger object such as a brown dwarf being the possible cause. The main results of Harrington's massive computer simulation involved over 170,000 computer runs was that based on the overall results, a good working model for the planet was determined to be one in a highly elliptical orbit at an angle of some 30 degrees from the ecliptic, with a long period of over 1,000 years, implying an orbital major axis of at least 296 AU, and that the major portion of the orbit was in the southern skies in the constellation Libra. He died in 1993, having been committed to the search right up to the very end. But if Planet X, or a brown dwarf, had been observed in 1983, as stated in the Washington Post article, then why was Harrington spending so much effort trying to determine its location in orbit? One problem was that IRIS had only made 2 observations of the object, separated in time, which is plenty for estimating its distance away using spectroscopy and redshift analysis, but not enough to determine its orbit. For that, at least 3 observations were needed. That object was most likely not the elusive Planet X anyway, if its distance was actually 50 billion miles. Simply put, whatever it was that they had observed in 1983, whether Planet X and or brown dwarf, they still don't know where it was going then, and later indications were that there may well be a Planet X much closer, and apparently a different object altogether than the one described in the Post article of 1983. In September 28, 1999, a BBC News Online posted an article about NASA's Pioneer probe titled by Dr. David Whitehouse. The story described news about Pioneer 10, launched by NASA in 1972 towards Jupiter and beyond the solar system, and its apparent encounter in deep space with an object well beyond the orbit of Neptune, which the article stated had occurred in December 1992, and the article cited researchers involved in the discovery as scientists from JPL NASA and an Italian scientist named Dr. Giacomo Giampieri from Westfield College in London. Dr. Giampieri said to the press, a short passage from that article, the probe's distance away then corresponds to 56 AU, which implies that since Pioneer 10 had detected nothing prior to that point, and that whatever was causing the anomaly at the time was apparently further yet away. This implies that if the cause had been Planet X, then distance of Pioneer 10 at the time can be used as a lower bound for the planet's distance away at later times as well. Earlier in 1992, before Harrington passed away, NASA had made a related press release that almost certainly originated with Harrington, and that statement said the following: probably the most explicit statement about Planet X distance from the Sun NASA ever made publicly. So there we have it. The science community believed they knew approximately how distant Planet X was, at least at 2 points in time, 5.2 or as much as 7+ billion miles away in 1992, according to NASA statements, and presuming the number is credible, 4.7 billion miles away in 1987, that according to a US-British science encyclopedia with an unidentified source, which was most likely NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. This number may actually derive from the 1983 IRIS satellite imagery, which is almost had to be, since there really was no other similar observations reported in that time frame, or it may have been a simple error in adapting the diagram published in a Science Digest article from 1982. If the data did actually come from IRIS, the closer numbers as being of greater concern, the first number at 5.2 billion miles is clearly 56 AU, and the 4.7 billion miles seems to correspond to 50.5 AU, although the Italian journalist Luca Scantamburlo has noted that the 4.7 billion miles might actually have been referred to in nautical miles instead of statute miles, since Pioneer 10 was being perturbed by something further out at 56 AU, as reported late 1992. With that change in units, the 47 billion miles corresponds to 58 AUs. Interestingly, if Planet X was coming towards us from a distance of 58 AUs in 1983, with a period of 1,000 years or more, its orbital velocity at that point would be in the range of 5 kilometers per second, which means the planet would be at about a 9.8 AU closer to us after a lapse of 9 year interval from 1983 to 1992, which equates to about a distance of 50.4 AU in 1990 and 48.2 AU in 1992. So that would mean that 30 years later now, a distance of 2 AUs, 6 it would be at 42 AUs from us now. This is roughly estimated to the 56 AU distance away from Pioneer 10, when the anomaly with this motion was announced by NASA in 1992, although in the wrong direction. Pioneer had just encountered its disturbance in late 1992, which means that if this was the cause, then Planet X should have been even further away at the time. And in fact, NASA's press release from 1992 stated that the planet was quite a bit farther out then, in fact more than 7 billion miles away from the Sun in total, which corresponds to 75.3 AU. This would imply that the Pioneer anomaly was experienced when Pioneer was some 19 AU from Planet X, quite a distance and a bit difficult to accept. But on the other hand, the gravitational deviation experienced was also extremely small. The net of this is that the distance of Pioneer 10 disturbance is more credible than the Encyclopedia's curious chart from 1986. Given all this, it seems reasonable that Planet X was most likely at least 50 AU away from the Sun in 1990, and possibly much farther away. This is my lower bound case, but any number of other possibilities can easily be evaluated as well using the following approval from celestial mechanics. Orbital dynamics. If we know how far away Planet X was from the Sun at some known point in time in the past, even approximately, we can use Kepler's laws to provide a rough approximation of where it is now and at any future point in its orbit. Interestingly, we don't have to know the mass or speed of the planet to do the calculations. Orbits follow very strict rules. The analysis does not take into account the motions of other planets or other perturbed influences, and so the predictions are therefore only approximate, but it does give an idea of expected transit times over long time intervals. The general solution to this two-body problem is provided in the standard text Fundamentals of Astrodynamics by Bate, Mueller, and White, which I have adapted for this study. The following is their approach together with several specific arrival scenarios based on NASA's data and other sources, some of which most likely also originated with NASA. The detailed sample problem has been worked out so that anyone who wants can generate any other desired cases of interest using only a hand calculator, which is what I used. For those wishing to skip the math and get to the bottom of the tables, a discussion section at the end provides a brief summary. Now, from Kepler's third law, we know that the period of t of an elliptic orbit of a small object around a much larger one, and he gives various examples here. This is very mathematical. So I'm not going to go into that. If you want to read it, you can read it in the body of the text. Now, the cases as above cases may seem somewhat random, but there are a couple of key trends that they show in addition to specific transition times. Long period orbits with small perihelia have very common characteristics. Notice that it takes about 31 years for an orbiting object to go from the outermost range of Pluto's orbit at 50 AU to Jupiter's orbit at 5 AU, and only a year more if we reduce the period by a factor of 3. This is largely due to the fact that the orbital velocity of the planet 50 AU away from the Sun hardly changes at all when we change the other orbital parameters, and as you can see, column 7, he says. And he discusses, to know approximately where Nibiru will be, Planet X would have been in 2015 at specific future times. We discuss equations essentially in reverse. And this again is quite, scientific. I'm not going to go into that. The last case is based on NASA's press release 1992 stating that indications at the time were pointing to an object about beyond 7 billion miles from the Sun, about 75 AU. Pioneer would have been about 19 AU away from it, and so the gravitational tug would have been extremely small according to NASA. So that's the arrival date. The arrival date. What is the arrival date? It's anywhere between 5 to 7 AUs. Now, there is also the something having to do with pictures taken by Scatamburlo, the Italian astronomer, in his study. And he says you may see on the desk some photographic prints of a couple of images sent to Scatamburlo in the year 2006 by a European insider who wanted to remain anonymous. Images printed before the years 1999 and 2000 on the Italian magazines Dossier Aliene and Hera. It was a leak of information coming from another insider, still anonymous. And according to Scatamburlo's source, they would portray an unknown planet, probably the 10th planet Nibiru, photographed by space probe Pioneer 10 during a flyby in the context of a hush-hush extended mission carried out after the official NASA mission. Now, presuming that NASA's assessment from the early 90s that Planet X was farther away, maybe considerably so, than 50 AU from the Sun in 1992, were accurate as stated at the time, then we should be able to use 50 AU from the Sun in 1992, 2 years prior, 1992, 1990, 1992, as a presumed lower bound for the desired estimate, and under the assumption we only need 2 other parameters to do the estimation. The period of the Planet X orbit, which we take as 3,600 years, and the closest point of approach to the Sun in perihelion, which we assume to be near the asteroid belt at 3.2 AU, but both parameters can be readily changed to consider other possibilities. Using the above set of assumptions and calculations, we see that for Planet X to reach Jupiter starting at 50 AU from the Sun requires almost 30 years, as indicated in the timetable. So this is all, we are at the 30-year point from the 1982-83 data, the Pioneer data. So we're there now. So the theory requires almost 30 years, as indicated in the table, the time that major havoc in the solar system would likely begin, which corresponds to about 2020 at the earliest, presuming that NASA's distance estimates applied to 1990 at the very earliest. Later observation dates only move Nibiru's arrival at Jupiter orbit out later in time. Perihelion at 3.2 AU is then reached 3 years later in 2023. Notice that the time to get to perihelion and to pass Jupiter is very insensitive to the length of the orbit, as long as it's fairly large. And even if we shorten perihelion to 2 AU, the time to reach Jupiter is only reduced by a year. This is astonishing. Now, if Planet X was at least 56 AU from the Sun in 1992, as evidence seems to indicate because of the point where Pioneer 10 began experiencing its course deviation anomaly, then the planet would arrive at Jupiter no sooner than about 35.5 years. So that means around the year 2027. I mean, look, celestial-wise, it's nothing. I mean, we're already at the end of 2021. Notice that this also is somewhat on the sooner than expected side, since Pioneer had experienced no gravitational tugs on the way out, which indicates that Planet X was still farther away at that time. The point of all this is that catastrophic events may be several years further out than many suspect, so the fact that nothing cataclysmic happens for a while should not be too surprising, but it certainly does not mean that catastrophe is not already well on its way. One other possible useful piece of data was provided by writer Marshall Masters, who has long studied and written about Planet X. Masters claimed to have been given some bootleg data and photos of the anonymous source, who got it from an insider at the South Pole Telescope Observatory in Antarctica. And using this information, Masters makes the assertion that in March 2008, Nibiru was in the Kuiper Belt, well beyond the orbit of Pluto. So even if we assume that Nibiru, Planet X, was right at the boundary of Pluto's outer orbit at 50 AU at that time, then knowing that to get to Jupiter from 50 AU away is a 30-year journey implies that Nibiru will arrive at Jupiter in the year 2038, at the earliest, assuming Marshall's evidence is valid. This is later than the above two cases, but still it's early enough for us, isn't it? I mean, that's it. What's the word? The fat lady will be singing at that time. Now, this is later than the above two cases, but almost a decade well before the 3-case estimate. An interesting connection with Masters data is that NASA's announcement in 1992 that Planet X at that time was greater than 7 billion miles away than 75 AU. At normal orbital speeds, this would equate to about 59 AU away in 2008. The date corresponds to Masters' pirated data, which was certainly well beyond the orbit of Pluto. The arrival of Nibiru at Jupiter, where Earth's problems begin in dire earnest using all the available evidence I'm aware of, therefore seems to be logically estimated at between 2029 and 2048 based on the analysis. This is astonishing estimates according to data from NASA JPL and Pioneer and physics, astronomy. Now, as an interesting side note, the well-known psychic Sylvia Brown gives rough time frames to the calamities she predicts are coming, which are largely consistent with some of the above estimates. And she states in her book from 2008, End of the World, that she sees the Earth's atmosphere and geophysical conditions beginning to degrade in 2018 and to worsen considerably in 2020s with monsoon rains on the eastern seaboard of North and South America and widespread tidal waves in 2025 to 30 time frame. She predicts that a pole shift will come about, although she never mentions Planet X or any other cosmological source for these events. And this is on Bended Reality Source RF. Okay, I'll leave it to you. What do you think about this? We already know that we have a decrease in Earth's magnetic field, and the scientists don't know why that is happening. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support.